My name is Stella. I am 34 years old and the CEO of Apex Crisis Management and Private Equity. I fix multi-million-dollar corporate disasters for a living. I am used to dealing with ruthless billionaires, corrupt executives, and hostile takeovers. My entire career is built on calculated aggression and flawless execution, but absolutely nothing prepared me for the terrifying phone call I received last Tuesday at noon. My sweet younger sister Clara, who was 7 months pregnant, was left abandoned on a desolate Texas highway in 104-degree heat by her own mother-in-law and sister-in-law. They took her wallet, they took her water. They drove away laughing and called it a hilarious prank. When I found her shivering on the blistering concrete of a rundown gas station, I did not scream or cry. I simply picked up my phone and unleashed the full weight of a financial empire to completely eradicate their existence. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic in-laws deserve exactly what is coming to them. The Texas sun was merciless that afternoon. The dashboard thermometer of my customized SUV glared a blinding 104 degrees. Heat waves shimmered off the asphalt, like a watery mirage, as I pushed the engine to its absolute limit, tearing down a rural stretch of interstate outside of Austin. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned stark white. My younger sister Clara had managed to borrow a phone from a kind stranger just long enough to drop a pin on her location before the call abruptly ended. Clara is 28 years old and the absolute kindest person I know. She works as a kindergarten teacher because she genuinely loves shaping the minds of young children. What her husband Bradley and his incredibly arrogant family do not know is that Clara and I are the primary beneficiaries of the untouchable Apex Family Trust. We come from generational wealth. She deliberately hid our massive fortune from them because she wanted a normal, grounded life. She wanted to be loved for who she was, not the billions of dollars attached to her last name. Unfortunately, the Reed family was completely obsessed with country club status and designer labels. Patricia Reed, her mother-in-law, and Courtney, her sister-in-law, constantly treated Clara like a broke gold digger who had somehow trapped Bradley into marriage. I always hated them, but I respected Clara's boundaries and kept my distance. That restraint died the moment I received her desperate call. I screeched into the dusty dirt lot of an abandoned-looking gas station. The heavy tires kicked up a massive cloud of dry earth and gravel. I threw the heavy door open before the car was even fully in park. The heat hit me like a physical blow, suffocating, heavy, and intensely oppressive. And then I saw her. Clara was slumped against a rusted ice machine in the narrow strip of shade provided by the building's peeling aluminum awning. She was 7 months pregnant and looked terrifyingly fragile in that moment. Her face was flushed a dangerous shade of crimson, and her breathing was terrifyingly shallow and rapid. She was shivering uncontrollably despite the extreme heat, which I knew was a severe sign of heat exhaustion, transitioning into heat stroke. I rushed to her side, dropping to my knees on the scorching concrete without a second thought. I grabbed the emergency water bottles I always kept in my vehicle, pouring one over a clean towel to press against the back of her neck and urging her to sip slowly from another. She leaned heavily into my shoulder, her hands trembling violently as she tried to hold the plastic bottle. She could barely speak, her lips dry and cracked from the arid wind. I asked her exactly what happened, keeping my voice perfectly level and soothing despite the violent rage boiling in my veins. Clara fumbled in her maternity jeans pocket and pulled out her cell phone. The battery was hovering at 2%. She handed the device to me without a single word. On the illuminated screen was a text message from Courtney. It read, "Oops, guess we forgot the extra baggage at the rest stop. Hope you wore walking shoes, broke girl. Consider it a prank." I stared at those glowing letters, letting their pure malice burn deep into my memory. They had stopped for gas. Clara had stepped out to use the restroom, and Patricia and Courtney had deliberately gotten back into Patricia's silver Mercedes and driven away. They left a heavily pregnant woman stranded on a desolate country road at the absolute peak of the midday heat. They had taken her purse, which was sitting in the back seat of their vehicle, meaning she had no money, no credit cards, and no identification. They left her with no water. If she had not had her phone in her pocket, she would have been completely cut off from the entire world. This was not a harmless prank. In this specific climate, under these extreme physical conditions, this was attempted murder. I did not waste precious time asking any more questions. I carefully lifted Clara, supporting her weight and guiding her into the aggressively air-conditioned sanctuary of my vehicle. I reclined the leather passenger seat, placing instant ice packs from my medical kit under her arms and across her forehead. I drove to the nearest emergency room, breaking every speed limit law in the state of Texas to get her there safely. The emergency medical staff took her back immediately, rushing her onto a stretcher and hooking her up to intravenous fluids to stabilize her core temperature and closely monitor the baby's erratic heart rate. I paced the sterile white hallway of the hospital, the rhythmic beeping of the fetal monitors echoing faintly from the adjacent room. The attending doctors assured me they had intervened just in time, but the sheer physical stress and severe dehydration had put both Clara and her unborn child in critical danger. I stopped pacing. I stood completely still in the middle of the corridor. I took a slow, deep breath, closing my eyes and letting the cold, analytical part of my brain take complete control. I am a corporate fixer. I dismantle massive companies and bankrupt corrupt executives before breakfast. I destroy people who think they are untouchable. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a highly encrypted number I knew by heart. My older brother Dominic answered on the second ring. Dominic is a ruthless venture capitalist, a man who plays global financial markets like a high-stakes game of chess. Dominic, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly hollow whisper. Put Jasmine on the phone right now. Jasmine is Dominic's wife, a brilliant African-American federal litigator whose razor-sharp legal mind is matched only by her lethal courtroom tactics. When I heard her voice come through the speaker alongside my brother, I delivered my instructions with absolute terrifying clarity. The Reeds just tried to kill Clara's baby. I told them everything. I told them about the cruel text message, the blistering heat, the stolen purse, and the sterile hospital room where my sister currently lay, connected to machines. Do what you do best, I commanded, my voice echoing off the stark hospital walls with absolute finality. Burn them to the ground. The emergency room was a symphony of sterile mechanical noises. The steady beeping of the fetal heart monitor provided a tiny measure of comfort against the overwhelming anxiety gripping me. Clara lay in the narrow hospital bed, her usually vibrant face pale and drained of color. An intravenous line was taped securely to her bruised hand, dripping vital fluids into her severely dehydrated body. I sat beside her, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. She was sleeping now, exhausted by the physical toll of surviving the blistering Texas sun. I used this quiet moment to mentally prepare for the war I had just initiated. Dominic and Jasmine were already setting the legal and financial traps that would soon close around the Reed family. Clara had hidden our family's massive wealth to ensure the people in her life loved her for her heart, not her bank account. And this was how they repaid her pure intentions. The heavy wooden door swung open. I turned my head to see who was interrupting our sanctuary. It was Bradley. Clara's husband strolled into the room with a bored expression. He wore a white polo shirt and khaki shorts, looking as though he had just stepped off his mother's country club golf course. In his right hand, he held a sweating plastic cup of iced coffee. He did not rush to his wife's bedside. He did not drop his beverage in a panic. Instead, he took a deliberate sip from his green plastic straw and let out an exasperated sigh. He looked at Clara sleeping, then turned his gaze to me. His posture was completely relaxed, shifting his weight to one leg, as if waiting in line at a grocery store. I stayed perfectly still, studying the man my sister had chosen to marry. I wanted to give him every opportunity to prove that he was not the spineless coward I had always suspected him to be. Look, I know this looks bad, Bradley began, waving his free hand dismissively in the direction of his pregnant wife. But my mom called me on the way here and explained everything. You are blowing this way out of proportion. Stella, chill out. My mom and Courtney were just playing a joke. Clara is fine. You guys are so dramatic. The words hung in the sterile air, toxic and heavy. A joke. He called leaving a pregnant woman stranded on a remote highway in 104-degree heat a joke. I watched Clara stir slightly at the sound of his voice. Her eyes fluttered open, heavy with exhaustion. When she saw Bradley standing there holding his iced coffee and rolling his eyes, she actually shrank back against the thin hospital pillows. A single tear escaped the corner of her eye, tracking slowly down her pale cheek. That heartbreaking movement was all the confirmation I needed. The marriage was over. The charade was done. I stood up. I did not shout or raise my voice a single decibel. In my line of work, the most dangerous people in the boardroom never yell. They speak quietly with terrifying conviction. I walked slowly around the hospital bed, closing the distance until I was standing less than a foot away from Bradley. He tried to maintain his arrogant smirk, but I saw the slight tremor in his jaw as he looked into my eyes. I reached out and took the iced coffee directly from his grip. He was so surprised by the smooth motion that he let it go without a fight. I turned, slightly held the cup over the gray trash can in the corner, and tipped it upside down. The ice and brown liquid splashed loudly into the plastic liner, ruining the silence of the room. I dropped the empty cup in after it, then turned my attention back to him. Your family left my pregnant sister on a highway in 104-degree heat, I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy register that seemed to freeze the air between us. You have exactly 10 seconds to leave this room before I have security remove you. Bradley blinked, his arrogant facade cracking just a fraction. You cannot kick me out, he stammered, attempting to puff out his chest. I am her husband. This is my baby too. My mom just made a mistake and you are acting like a lunatic. 8 seconds, I replied, stepping 1 inch closer. Do not make the mistake of thinking I am asking you, Bradley. I am telling you. You are a liability to her health and a liability to my patients. Walk out that door right now or I will personally drag you out by the collar of your expensive country club shirt. He looked past me to Clara, hoping for a lifeline, hoping the forgiving woman he had married would save him from her terrifying older sister. But Clara simply turned her face away, staring blankly at the beige hospital wall. She was finally seeing him clearly, and there was nothing left to save. Bradley let out a loud, mocking scoff, throwing his hands up in exaggerated surrender. Fine, he muttered, backing toward the heavy wooden door. Have it your way. But you are crazy, both of you. I do not need to deal with these crazy in-laws today. He turned and walked out, letting the door slam shut behind him. He did not look back. He did not ask if the baby was safe. He simply walked away to protect his own bruised ego. The room settled back into the quiet, rhythmic beeping of the medical machinery. I walked back to Clara's side and gently took her hand again. Her fingers were cold, but she squeezed my hand with a surprising amount of strength. I looked down at her and offered a small, reassuring smile. The worst part of this is finally over, I promised her softly. Now we handle the consequences. The steady rhythm of Clara's heart monitor faded as I stepped out of her private room and into the harsh fluorescent glare of the hospital corridor. I left 2 of my personal security contractors outside her door with strict instructions. No one named Reed was allowed near my sister. I walked down the sterile hallways, my heels clicking against the polished linoleum floor, descending toward the basement cafeteria. The sharp scent of medical bleach gave way to the dull smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. It was practically empty at this hour, a cavernous space filled with generic round tables and plastic chairs. This was not my usual boardroom, but it would serve our purposes perfectly. I purchased a black coffee from a tired cashier and selected a small table in the corner facing the entrance. I needed to see them coming. Within 10 minutes, the heavy double doors of the cafeteria swung open. Dominic walked in first, moving with the predatory grace that made him one of the most feared venture capitalists on Wall Street. He wore a charcoal suit, his silk tie already loosened, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line of fury. Right beside him was Jasmine. My sister-in-law is a striking African-American woman who commands absolute authority the moment she enters. As a federal litigator, She destroys prominent careers before lunch and never loses a moment of sleep. She was wearing a crimson blazer that contrasted sharply with the dull hospital surroundings, carrying a silver briefcase that I knew contained enough digital ammunition to ruin lives. They did not pause to buy coffee. They walked directly to my table and sat down in unison. Dominic leaned forward, placing his large hands flat on the laminated table surface. His dark eyes locked onto mine, searching for the update I had delayed giving them over the phone. I told them everything. I detailed the severe dehydration, the doctor's stabilization efforts, and the cowardice of Bradley sipping iced coffee while his wife recovered from near death. Dominic clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles mirrored the stark white of his shirt collar. Jasmine did not show anger. Instead, she unclasped her briefcase with a sharp metallic click and withdrew her laptop. The bright screen illuminated her face in the dim corner of the cafeteria. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing encrypted servers and private financial databases, faster than most people could check their email. She pulled up the master ledger of the Apex Family Trust. The numbers on the screen were staggering 9- and 10-digit figures managed by offshore accounts and private equity portfolios. Right there, highlighted in bold blue text, was Clara's name listed as a primary beneficiary alongside Dominic and myself. It always infuriated me that Clara chose to live on a modest kindergarten teacher salary of $45,000 a year. She drove a sensible used sedan clipped paper grocery coupons and furnished her small house with vintage thrift store finds. She desperately wanted to prove to herself that she could build a normal, humble existence entirely away from the crushing pressure of our immense generational wealth. The foolish Reeds thought they were so vastly superior simply because they had a local country club membership and leased luxury cars. They constantly looked down on Clara, openly mocking her modest lifestyle, completely oblivious to the objective fact that my sweet little sister could literally buy their entire affluent neighborhood with a single phone call and turn their precious country club into a paved parking lot. Jasmine smoothly tapped the touchpad, minimizing the highly classified trust documents and pulling up a completely new set of deeply buried financial records. She tilted the glowing screen slightly so Dominic and I could clearly see the cascading columns of bright red numbers. Jasmine smiled a dangerous, brilliant curve of her lips that immediately signaled absolute destruction. I ran a preliminary background check, she said, her voice remarkably smooth and melodic, yet entirely lethal. Richard Reed likes to project the grand image of a mighty titan of industry. However, his logistics company is currently drowning in $20 million of insurmountable debt. They are exactly 3 weeks away from complete bankruptcy. I leaned back in my uncomfortable plastic chair, letting the glorious magnitude of that revelation wash over me completely. The arrogant patriarch of the Reed family, the pompous man who happily funded Patricia's lavish country club luncheons and blindly paid for Courtney's ridiculous designer shopping sprees, was secretly suffocating under a massive mountain of leveraged loans. They were desperately maintaining an exhausting illusion of wealth, while their entire financial foundation crumbled beneath their feet. They targeted Clara because they incorrectly thought she was weak, assuming she was just a poor, defenseless teacher who would quietly accept their daily abuse without ever fighting back. They had absolutely no idea they had just deeply provoked a family holding enough liquid capital to legally dismantle their entire fragile empire in a matter of days. Dominic looked intently at the screen, a dark, menacing chuckle escaping his throat. $20 million is nothing to us, he murmured softly, his intelligent eyes already calculating the most painful angles of attack. We could easily buy that debt by tomorrow morning. Jasmine nodded in agreement, her fingers already drafting the necessary legal injunctions. We buy the debt, we freeze their credit lines, and we ruthlessly squeeze them until they cannot breathe. I took a slow sip of my terrible coffee, feeling the bitter caffeine mingle with the powerful adrenaline pumping through my system. We do not just squeeze them, I corrected quietly. We make them feel exactly what Clara felt on that highway. We leave them stranded, totally isolated, and completely stripped of their precious resources. We take away the only thing they actually care about in this world. their fake status. Jasmine closed her laptop with a definitive, satisfying snap. Consider the crushing paperwork started right now, she promised firmly. I left Dominic and Jasmine to their digital warfare in the hospital basement. My immediate focus shifted to a personal objective. The medical staff had assured me Clara was resting comfortably under the watchful eyes of my private security detail. I had a brief window of opportunity to handle the architects of her suffering directly. I walked out of the hospital, stepping into the oppressive wall of Texas heat that had nearly claimed my sister just hours before. The stifling humidity fueled the cold determination settling deep within my chest. I climbed into the air-conditioned sanctuary of my vehicle and programmed the navigation system for the most exclusive address in the county. The Oakmont Country Club was a sprawling estate designed specifically to keep ordinary people outside its gilded gates. It was exactly the kind of superficial paradise where Patricia and Courtney Reed spent their afternoons pretending to be royalty. The drive took less than 20 minutes. I pulled my customized vehicle up to the polished valet stand, ignoring the young attendant who rushed forward to open my door. I handed him the keys without a single glance and walked straight toward the doors of the main clubhouse. The receptionist, a sharply dressed woman with a practiced smile, attempted to intercept me as I strode across the marble foyer. She opened her mouth to ask for my membership credentials, but my posture and the uncompromising look in my eyes made her hesitate just long enough for me to bypass her desk. In my line of work, you learn very quickly that absolute confidence is a universal skeleton key. People rarely question someone who walks as if they own the entire building. I navigated the opulent corridors with methodical precision, the heavy carpet silencing my footsteps. I followed the quiet murmur of privileged conversation until I reached the entrance of the exclusive dining terrace. The space was bright and airy, enclosed by floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the pristine 18th hole of the championship golf course. White linen tablecloths fluttered slightly in the controlled breeze of the ceiling fans. It did not take me long to spot my targets. Patricia and Courtney Reed were holding court at a large table right in the center of the room, surrounded by 3 other women dressed in equally expensive sundresses. Patricia held a tall glass of orange juice and champagne, gesturing expansively with her manicured hand as she entertained her captive audience. Courtney sat beside her, typing rapidly on her smartphone. I walked slowly across the dining room, my eyes locked directly on Patricia. I did not rush. I wanted them to feel the slow, inevitable approach of consequences. As I neared their table, one of Patricia's friends noticed me, and her polite smile faded into an expression of confusion. Patricia stopped mid-sentence, turning her head to follow her friend's gaze. The moment she saw me, the confident, arrogant smile on her face fractured. Courtney looked up from her screen a second later, her eyes widening in genuine surprise. They clearly had not expected to see me here in their heavily guarded sanctuary, less than 4 hours after they had committed an atrocity on the side of a highway. I stopped directly behind Patricia's plush chair, utterly unbothered by the stares of the wealthy women surrounding her. I did not raise my voice, but the sudden, heavy silence that fell over their specific table made my words perfectly audible to everyone sitting nearby. I found Clara. I said, my tone as sharp and smooth as a freshly polished blade. She is currently connected to intravenous fluids in a hospital room, recovering from severe heat stroke and extreme dehydration. The doctors are monitoring the baby for signs of permanent distress because you abandoned a pregnant woman on a dirt road in the middle of the afternoon. Patricia's friends gasped in unison, scandalized by the raw, ugly truth invading their pleasant afternoon luncheon. They looked at Patricia with wide, questioning eyes, waiting for a rational explanation. Instead of displaying any remorse, Patricia simply adjusted her posture, attempting to regain her perceived dominance. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her cold mimosa, looking up at me with an expression of profound boredom. "Oh, please," Patricia scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Clara needed the exercise. Stop trying to extort us, you blue-collar nobodies." She waved her hand dismissively, turning back to her shocked friends with a tight, reassuring smile. "It was just a harmless joke among family. You are completely overreacting as usual. We are not paying for your dramatic hospital bills just because your sister cannot take a simple prank." Courtney chimed in, pointing her phone at me. Yeah, you should leave before we call security. This club is for members only, not for poor people looking for a quick payout. I did not flinch. I did not argue with their staggering delusion. I simply stepped closer to Patricia, invading her personal space, until she was forced to lean back in her chair. I placed my hands flat on the table, leaning down until my face was only inches from hers. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, ensuring she felt the crushing weight of my presence. I looked deep into her eyes, seeing the tiny flicker of genuine fear beneath her arrogant facade. She was trying to be brave in front of her friends, but she knew she had crossed a line. You think you are untouchable because you have a membership here, I whispered into her ear, my voice so cold it could shatter glass. Enjoy the mimosa today, Patricia. It is the last drink you will ever afford. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my jacket, knowing the countdown to their complete financial ruin had officially begun. I did not wait for any response. I turned my back on their table and walked slowly out of the quiet dining room, leaving them to their brief, pathetic illusions. I walked out of the Oakmont Country Club and stepped back into the suffocating heat of the Texas afternoon. The valet brought my vehicle around, but I barely registered his presence. My mind was calculating the trajectory of the strike we were about to launch. As I steered the heavy SUV onto the highway, heading back toward the medical center, my phone connected automatically to the secure conference line. Dominic and Jasmine were already waiting. The initial reconnaissance was complete, and it was time for the financial autopsy of the Reed family legacy. Jasmine had relocated from the hospital cafeteria to the private executive suite I maintained in downtown Austin. She had established a secure uplink to her federal databases, bypassing civilian firewalls with the authorized clearance of a highest-level government litigator. When I walked into the suite 40 minutes later, the room was bathed in the cool blue light of multiple monitors. Jasmine was a silent predator swimming through oceans of encrypted data. I poured myself a glass of iced water from the wet bar and stood behind her ergonomic chair, watching the numbers cascade across the expansive screens. Dominic sat on the leather sofa, reviewing a printed dossier, with a look of supreme satisfaction. "Tell me you found the arteries," I said softly, taking a slow sip. Jasmine did not look away from her monitors. Her fingers moved in a blur across the mechanical keyboard. "I did not just find the arteries," she replied, her melodic voice laced with pure danger. "I found the disease infecting their entire system. Richard Reed is not just a terrible businessman who made a few bad investments. He is a prolific criminal." She tapped a key, and a complex web of transactions expanded across the largest screen. For the past 7 years, Richard has been committing massive systemic tax fraud. He established a network of phantom logistics vendors, billing his own company for shipping routes that do not actually exist. He then funneled that corporate revenue directly into offshore shell accounts to evade federal taxes. My eyes followed the digital trail Jasmine had so expertly illuminated. The money did not stay offshore for long. Jasmine brought up a secondary window cross, checking the shell accounts with personal expenditure reports. The corporate funds were systematically laundered back into the domestic economy to finance the illusion of their immense generational wealth. Those expensive country club memberships and the imported champagne Patricia was drinking an hour ago were all paid for with stolen corporate capital. And Courtney is no better. Dominic chimed in, flipping a page in his dossier. Jasmine tracked the purchasing history of Courtney's primary black card. She has been funding her ridiculous social media lifestyle, the designer handbags, the luxury vacations, the expensive shoes, entirely through a fraudulent corporate expense account listed under office supplies and client entertainment. They are a family of beautifully dressed parasites living on borrowed time and stolen money. They look down on my sister for living a humble life, completely unaware that their own luxurious existence was a fragile house of cards. I smiled, feeling the cold satisfaction settle deep in my bones. "Package the evidence for the Internal Revenue Service," I instructed Jasmine. Jasmine paused. Her hand stopped moving over the keyboard, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. The satisfaction in her eyes was replaced by a sharp, protective anger. "The corporate fraud is massive," Jasmine said, her voice dropping an octave. But there is something else. Something smaller but infinitely more disgusting. I moved closer to the desk, setting my glass down. What did you find? Jasmine brought up a modest joint checking account. It was the account Clara and Bradley shared, the one where my sister faithfully deposited her humble kindergarten teacher salary every 2 weeks. Clara budgeted carefully to ensure they lived within their means. Bradley is not involved in his father's corporate embezzlement, Jasmine explained, highlighting a series of recurring automatic transfers. But he has his own brand of theft. For the past 14 months, Bradley has been secretly siphoning 70% of Clara's monthly paycheck into a hidden private account under his middle name. He set up an automatic routing protocol that disguised the transfers as automated utility payments and insurance premiums. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening with a new layer of rage. What is he buying with her money? I asked. Dominic stood up from the sofa, tossing the dossier onto the glass coffee table in disgust. He is paying the lease on his imported sports car, Dominic answered. The vintage Porsche he drives to his meaningless job. He told Clara his parents bought it for him as a wedding gift. In reality, he has been draining his pregnant wife's tiny, modest teaching salary to pay the exorbitant monthly premium, leaving her to stress over the cost of basic groceries and baby supplies. The utter depravity of the situation washed over me. Bradley was not just a spineless coward who abandoned his wife at a hospital. He was a financial predator feeding on the kindest person I knew. He watched Clara stress over the cost of prenatal vitamins while driving a luxury vehicle funded by her stolen labor. I looked at the glowing monitors, absorbing every detail of their crimes. The Reeds had built their entire identities on lies, theft, and cruelty. They had victimized my sister financially and emotionally. Jasmine turned her chair to face me, her expression resolute. We have the corporate kill switch, and we have the personal kill switch, she stated calmly. How do you want to proceed? I picked up my glass of cold water, the ice cubes clinking softly in the silence. We freeze the illusion first, I decided. But long before officially dropping the final corporate hammer, we need to completely secure Clara legally. Bradley will soon realize his cash flow is threatened, and he will panic. Prepare for him to make a very desperate, incredibly foolish move. My prediction proved accurate. Soon after uncovering his financial parasitism, my security detail outside Clara's hospital room sent an alert. Bradley had returned not alone. Security footage showed him marching down the corridor accompanied by a man in a poorly tailored suit carrying a briefcase. I signaled Jasmine and we left to intercept them. My men had orders to let Bradley inside but monitor the situation while we rushed across the city. Inside the hospital room, the atmosphere was thick with manipulation. I watched the live feed from my tablet. Clara sat up in bed, deeply exhausted from her ordeal. Bradley stood at the foot of her bed, his posture rigid, his voice dripping with condescension. He actively gaslighted his pregnant wife, twisting the highway abandonment into a story where Clara was the villain. You need to understand how much stress you caused my family, Bradley said, waving his hand in dismissal of her medical monitors. My mother is devastated. Your sister is threatening us. Stella came to the country club and made a massive scene. We are trying to protect our legacy, Clara. Your family is attempting to extort us. The lawyer stepped forward and produced a stack of legal documents. He placed them directly on Clara's tray table right next to her untouched hospital lunch. He clicked a silver pen and laid it on top of the crisp white pages. This is a standard post-nuptial agreement, the lawyer explained, his tone oily. Given the recent threats made by your sister, Bradley's family requires a guarantee their assets remain protected. It is a formality, really. Just sign on the dotted line and we can all move past this drama. I watched the screen, my heart pounding with anxiety. Clara looked down at the documents, then up at the man she had loved and trusted. She saw the absolute emptiness in his eyes. She saw the man who stole her meager salary to finance his sports car, the man who abandoned her while she was connected to intravenous fluids. No, Clara said softly. Her voice was quiet, but it did not tremble. Bradley sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. Clara, stop being difficult. Just sign the paper so we can go home and forget about this. You are being hysterical because of pregnancy hormones. Clara pushed the tray table away. The metal wheels squeaked loudly. "I am not hysterical," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "Your mother left me to die on a dirt road. You walked out on me when I was fighting for our baby. And now you bring a lawyer into my hospital room to protect your money. I am not signing anything. Leave." Bradley stepped closer, his face darkening with genuine anger. "You are going to sign it, Clara. You have nothing without me. You are a kindergarten teacher. You cannot afford to fight my family." That was the exact moment Jasmine and I stepped through the heavy wooden door of the hospital room. "Actually, Bradley, she can afford to buy and sell your entire miserable bloodline before her afternoon nap," Jasmine announced, her voice ringing out like a judge delivering a verdict. Bradley and his lawyer spun around, startled by our entrance. The lawyer puffed out his chest, attempting to regain control of the room. "Excuse me," he barked, adjusting his cheap tie. "This is a private legal conversation between a husband and his wife. You need to exit immediately." Jasmine smiled. It was the same lethal smile I had seen in my office. She walked smoothly past Bradley, positioning herself directly between the two men and Clara's bed. She did not raise her voice, but the authority radiating from her was absolute. "I am Jasmine Carter, federal litigator and designated legal counsel for the Apex Family Trust," she stated, her words slicing through the air. "I represent Clara, and you, sir, are attempting to coerce a hospitalized patient under medical duress into signing a legally binding financial contract without her retained counsel present. That is a direct violation of state bar ethics and a fantastic foundation for a malpractice lawsuit." The lawyer blinked, his false confidence shattering instantly. He recognized the predatory tone of a superior attorney. "I am just representing my client's interests," he stammered, taking a small step backward toward the door. "Your client has no interest left to represent," Jasmine countered smoothly. She picked up the post-nuptial agreement using only her thumb and index finger. She tore the thick stack of papers directly in half, the ripping sound echoing sharply in the quiet room. She dropped the destroyed documents into the nearby trash bin, right on top of the iced coffee I discarded. "Let me educate you on the current legal landscape," Jasmine continued, stepping toward the trembling lawyer. "If you ever approach my client again, I will file an injunction against you for predatory coercion. I will submit a formal grievance to the ethics board before you make it to the parking garage. Furthermore, I will ensure every judge views your license as a liability." The lawyer turned pale. He looked at Bradley, then at Jasmine, calculating his survival odds. He chose survival. He grabbed his empty briefcase, muttered a frantic apology, and sprinted out the door, abandoning his client without a second thought. Bradley stood alone, his mouth hanging open in complete disbelief. He looked at Clara, but she simply turned her head, refusing to acknowledge his existence. "You have 5 seconds to follow your legal representation out that door," I told him, pointing toward the hallway. "And Bradley, when you check your bank accounts tomorrow, remember this." Bradley backed away, stumbling over his own feet as he retreated into the corridor. The heavy door closed, leaving the three of us alone in the quiet hospital room. Clara looked at Jasmine and me, a beautiful, genuine smile finally breaking through her deep exhaustion. The vile coercion had completely failed, and the legal trap was now fully set. With Clara finally safe and legally shielded from her parasitic husband, I returned to the towering glass and steel headquarters of Apex Crisis Management and Private Equity. It was time to initiate the financial suffocation of the Reed family. Dominic was already pacing the length of my executive office when I arrived, his phone pressed firmly to his ear as he negotiated the final terms of our most recent acquisition. The Reeds maintained their lavish lifestyle through a highly leveraged line of credit issued by a regional banking institution that was currently struggling to maintain its own liquidity. It took Dominic less than 4 hours to leverage our massive capital reserves and quietly purchase the entire toxic debt portfolio of that specific bank. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Apex Holdings was the official and sole proprietor of every single credit line, mortgage, and corporate loan attached to Richard, Patricia, and Courtney Reed. We did not just own their debt, we owned their entire fragile reality. I sat behind my polished mahogany desk, opened my secure terminal, and authorized the immediate suspension of their accounts due to suspected fraudulent activity. I pressed the enter key, watching the digital status markers turn from green to a solid, unforgiving red. The financial guillotine had dropped silently, and now we only had to wait for them to notice they had been decapitated. I did not have to wait long to witness the spectacular fallout. I instructed my intelligence team to monitor Courtney Reed's highly active social media accounts. Courtney fancied herself a prominent lifestyle influencer, constantly broadcasting her unearned wealth to thousands of impressionable followers who believed she was a legitimate heiress. I leaned back in my leather chair, picked up a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, and cast her current live stream onto the massive flat-screen monitor mounted on my office wall. The high-definition video feed showed Courtney standing in the center of an exclusive designer boutique in downtown Austin. She was holding a vibrant pink leather handbag up to the camera, admiring her own reflection in the boutique mirrors. She wore oversized designer sunglasses indoors and spoke to her digital audience with an insufferable condescending drawl. She bragged extensively about the upcoming weekend, casually mentioning how much money she planned to drop on the upcoming spring collection. Behind her, a polite sales associate was carefully wrapping several expensive pairs of shoes and a silk scarf in premium tissue paper. Courtney spun around her phone, capturing the towering stack of designer shopping bags waiting for her at the pristine glass checkout counter. She promised her loyal followers an exclusive unboxing video later that evening, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire curated universe was about to shatter on a live public broadcast. I took a slow, satisfying sip of my coffee as Courtney finally approached the register. The total came to an absurd amount, well over $14,000 for a single afternoon of frivolous indulgence. She did not even blink at the outrageous sum. With a practiced, arrogant flick of her wrist, she pulled a heavy metal black card from her wallet and handed it to the smiling sales associate. The woman swiped the card through the gleaming terminal. A sharp, negative beep echoed through the quiet boutique. Courtney kept her phone pointed at her own face, smiling at the camera while she waited for the receipt to print. But the associate frowned, her polite demeanor faltering slightly. "I am terribly sorry, Miss Reed," the associate whispered, leaning forward discreetly. "The machine says the transaction has been declined." Courtney rolled her eyes dramatically for her audience, letting out an exaggerated sigh of annoyance. She complained loudly about banking security protocols being too strict for high-net-worth individuals, playing off the embarrassment as a minor inconvenience. She reached into her wallet and withdrew a second premium platinum card, tossing it onto the glass counter. "Run that one," she instructed, her tone dripping with unearned superiority. The associate swiped the second card. Another sharp negative beep filled the air. The terminal flashed the same red warning: declined. I watched Courtney's confident smile begin to slip, revealing the first genuine signs of panic beneath her heavy makeup. "This cannot be right." Courtney snapped, her voice losing its measured melodic quality. "Run it again. There is plenty of money in that account." The associate tried again with the exact same humiliating result. The few other wealthy patrons in the boutique were beginning to stare. Courtney frantically dug through her designer wallet, pulling out a third credit card, a corporate expense card issued under her father's logistics company. She shoved it at the associate, her hands visibly shaking on the live broadcast. She had forgotten to turn off the camera. Thousands of people were currently watching her unravel in real time. The associate swiped the corporate card. A loud, continuous error tone sounded from the machine. The screen displayed a harsh message instructing the merchant to confiscate the card immediately. "I am so sorry, but I have to retain this card," the associate said, her voice tight with discomfort as she pulled the plastic square behind the counter. Courtney completely lost her mind. She started screaming at the associate, demanding her cards back, throwing a massive, undignified tantrum in the middle of the luxury store. She shrieked that her father would buy the entire building and fire everyone. Her followers flooded the live chat with laughing emojis and mocking comments, recording every second of her spectacular humiliation. I sat in my quiet, climate-controlled office, watching her desperate world burn to ash on my screen. I took one final deep drink of my incredibly strong black coffee, quietly savoring the sharp, bitter taste and the absolute, undeniable perfection of her total public financial ruin. The arrogant illusion was permanently frozen forever, and the real-world consequences were finally just beginning to unfold right before my very own watching eyes now. The satisfaction of watching Courtney completely humiliate herself on a live global broadcast was merely a brief prelude to the absolute destruction we had planned for the rest of her arrogant family. My secure mobile device vibrated quietly against the polished mahogany surface of my executive desk, flashing an urgent priority notification from the private security contractors I had personally stationed outside Clara's recovery room. The message was brief, but highly informative. Patricia and Richard Reed had just entered the main lobby of the medical center. They were not alone, and they were certainly not coming to offer genuine contrition for their unforgivable actions on that blistering Texas highway. Jasmine had already anticipated this desperate, calculating move. She had left my downtown office shortly after we initiated the financial freeze, correctly deducing that the Reeds would attempt a pathetic damage control maneuver once they realized their accounts were inexplicably paralyzed. They were incredibly arrogant, but they were not entirely stupid. The sudden catastrophic failure of their premium credit cards and the immediate suspension of their corporate accounts had undoubtedly triggered a massive wave of panic within their household. However, in their monumental delusion, they likely assumed Clara was somehow behind a minor legal injunction or a temporary financial hold stemming from a basic domestic dispute. They believed they could simply smooth things over with a superficial performance. I connected to the secure hospital surveillance feed on my secondary monitor, watching the scene unfold in high definition. Patricia and Richard Reed marched down the sterile white corridor of the maternity ward, projecting a completely fabricated aura of upper-class grace and maternal concern. The reality of their presentation, however, was shockingly pathetic. Patricia, a woman who ordinarily refused to be seen carrying anything less than a massive arrangement of imported orchids, was gripping a sad wilted bouquet of cheap carnations, clearly purchased from a generic grocery store display, on their frantic drive over. Her usually flawless designer outfit looked slightly rumpled, and the tense, panicked set of her jaw betrayed her deep internal anxiety. Richard walked stiffly beside her, attempting to project corporate dominance but failing miserably. Most disgustingly trailing just a few steps behind them was a young, nervous-looking man carrying a professional digital camera with a heavy flash attachment. They had actually hired a local public relations photographer to document their visit. They intended to stage a heartwarming, forgiving family reunion right there in the hospital room, a desperately calculated photo opportunity designed to provide visual evidence of family harmony in case Clara attempted to file a police report or initiate a civil lawsuit regarding the highway abandonment. They approached Clara's private room, with practiced artificial smiles plastered across their faces, completely unprepared for the immovable barrier standing directly in their path. Jasmine stepped out of the shadows of the alcove, positioning herself squarely in the center of the doorway. Her crimson blazer stood out sharply against the pale hospital walls, and her posture radiated pure, uncompromising authority. My two private security contractors flanked her silently, their arms crossed over their dark suits, their presence alone radiating a silent threat of physical removal. Patricia stopped in her tracks, her fake smile faltering as she looked at Jasmine with a mixture of confusion and immediate disdain. She clearly did not recognize the brilliant federal litigator standing before her, likely assuming Jasmine was just a minor hospital administrator or an overly aggressive social worker. "Excuse us," Patricia said, her tone dripping with that familiar, sickening country club condescension. "We are here to see our daughter-in-law. We have brought her some lovely flowers to brighten her room, and we are quite anxious to check on our precious grandchild. Be a dear and step aside so we can have a private family moment." She gestured toward the hired photographer, signaling him to raise his camera and prepare for the anticipated emotional embrace. Jasmine did not move a single millimeter. She looked down at the pathetic bouquet of carnations, then shifted her piercing gaze to Patricia's perfectly made-up face. "You are not going anywhere near that room," Patricia Jasmine stated, her melodic voice carrying a sharp, dangerous edge that echoed clearly down the quiet hospital corridor. "There will be no staged apologies today. There will be no damage control photographs to save your crumbling social reputation. You have permanently forfeited your right to any contact with Clara or her unborn child." Richard stepped forward, his face flushing with sudden indignant anger. He attempted to use his physical size to intimidate her, a tactic that might have worked on a weaker person but was absolutely useless against a federal shark like Jasmine. "Now listen here, young woman," Richard barked, pointing a thick finger in Jasmine's direction. "I am Richard Reed. That is my son's wife in that bed, and you have absolutely no legal authority to prevent us from visiting our own family member. Move out of the way immediately, or I will have the hospital administration terminate your employment before you can even blink." Jasmine smiled, a cold, predatory expression that made Richard hesitate and lower his hand. She calmly unbuttoned her blazer and reached into the inner pocket, withdrawing a thick, folded legal document bearing the unmistakable seal of a federal judge. "I do not work for this hospital," Richard Jasmine explained smoothly, her enunciation precise and terrifyingly calm. "I am federal legal counsel representing Clara's interests. And this document is a finalized court-ordered restraining order effectively banning you, your wife, your daughter, and your son from coming within 500 feet of my client." She thrust the heavy document directly into Richard's chest, forcing him to take it or let it fall to the floor. He grabbed it instinctively, his eyes scanning the bold legal print as the color rapidly drained from his face. Patricia peered over his shoulder, her jaw dropping open in genuine, unfiltered horror. The photographer, unsure of what was happening, but recognizing a dramatic moment, instinctively began snapping pictures, the bright flash illuminating their absolute devastation. Furthermore, Jasmine continued, her voice rising just enough to ensure the hospital security cameras captured every single syllable. "This restraining order is supported by a preliminary criminal investigation. Let me specifically cite the Texas Penal Code for your immediate education. Under Title 5, Chapter 22, your actions yesterday constitute the reckless endangerment of a vulnerable individual, specifically a pregnant woman. Abandoning an incapacitated person in a remote location under extreme environmental conditions of 104-degree heat is a felony offense. You did not play a prank, Patricia. You committed an aggravated assault, and you will be facing severe criminal prosecution." Patricia dropped the cheap carnations. They hit the linoleum floor with a soft, pathetic thud. She looked frantically at the photographer, who was still snapping rapid-fire photos of their public humiliation, capturing the exact moment their arrogant facade completely shattered. "Stop taking pictures!" Patricia shrieked, batting her hands toward the camera lens. "This is a misunderstanding. This is a complete lie." "It is not a lie, and you are entirely out of time," Jasmine stated with finality. "You have exactly 30 seconds to vacate these premises before these security contractors physically restrain you and hand you over to the local police department for violating a federal order. I suggest you turn around and walk away while you still possess a tiny shred of your false dignity." Richard grabbed Patricia's arm, his previous bluster entirely replaced by the cold, hard reality of impending criminal charges. He pulled his wife down the hallway, retreating in absolute disgrace, while the photographer awkwardly scrambled after them, carrying digital proof of their magnificent failure. While the Reeds were retreating from the hospital in total humiliation, the corporate trap I had meticulously prepared was finally ready to be sprung. Richard Reed returned to his expansive, ostentatiously decorated corner office in a state of absolute, unmitigated panic. His personal world was collapsing rapidly, but his professional world was already fully engulfed in flames. By the time he sat down behind his massive desk, his internal accounting department had sent him 32 frantic voicemails. Payroll had completely bounced. Several major suppliers had abruptly halted all outstanding shipments due to non-payment. The phantom logistics vendors he used to launder his stolen money had been electronically frozen. Worst of all, his primary financial institution had informed him that his entire massive debt portfolio had been aggressively purchased by an anonymous private equity firm, and his lines of credit were permanently terminated. He was suffocating, drowning in a $20 million ocean of debt with absolutely no life raft in sight. In his desperate, blinding panic, Richard did exactly what a cornered, arrogant man always does. He searched for a bigger predator to save him from the wolves. He frantically researched the name of the holding company that had acquired his debt. He found the sleek, minimalist corporate website for Apex Holdings. The site revealed very little about the private equity firm's primary leadership, presenting only an imposing corporate facade of infinite wealth and aggressive market acquisitions. Richard had absolutely no idea that the sister of the pregnant woman his family had just tortured was the sole chief executive officer of that exact enterprise. He saw only a massive pool of capital, and he immediately dialed the primary contact number begging for a financial lifeline. I sat in my quiet office listening through the secure internal communication system as Richard's call was routed directly to Marcus, my most ruthless senior proxy and lead acquisition specialist. Marcus sat 2 doors down from me, lounging comfortably in his chair, while a desperate Richard pleaded his case over the speakerphone. "Please, you have to understand." Richard begged, his voice cracking with the strain of his impending ruin. "The logistics market is just experiencing a temporary downturn. My company has incredible long-term value. We just need a minor restructuring bailout. If Apex Holdings can provide a bridge loan and restructure our current debt obligations, I can guarantee a massive return on your investment within the next fiscal quarter. Our fundamentals are incredibly strong." Marcus let a heavy, agonizing silence hang on the line for a full 15 seconds, allowing Richard to sweat through his expensive tailored suit. When Marcus finally spoke, his tone was smooth, predatory, and perfectly calibrated to manipulate a desperate man. "Mr. Reed," Marcus began, his voice dripping with corporate authority, "Apex Holdings does not typically engage in bridge loans for failing logistics companies with highly questionable accounting practices. We are well aware of the discrepancies in your recent tax filings. However, we are occasionally interested in acquiring distressed assets if the current management can prove they possess the necessary stability to execute a rigorous turnaround strategy." Richard exhaled a loud, shaking breath of pure relief. "Yes, absolutely," he stammered eagerly. "I can prove our stability. I have a comprehensive recovery plan ready to present. Just give me a meeting." "We require more than just a standard financial presentation." Richard Marcus continued, smoothly baiting the trap. "When Apex Holdings invests capital, we invest in the character of the executive leadership. We have heard concerning rumors regarding the internal stability of your household. A corporate leader whose family is in turmoil is a profound financial liability to our firm. If you want us to even consider halting the foreclosure on your assets, we require a demonstration of absolute solidarity." "I will do whatever you ask," Richard promised blindly, completely surrendering his leverage. "Name your conditions." Marcus smiled, looking directly at the glass wall separating our offices. "I require an in-person meeting tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock at the Apex headquarters building. But you will not come alone. You will bring your entire immediate family. I want to meet your wife, Patricia, your son, Bradley, and your daughter, Courtney. You will sit together in our boardroom, and you will prove to our executive committee that the Reed family is unified, stable, and worthy of our immense financial protection. If anyone is missing, the deal is dead, and we will liquidate your entire company by noon." "I understand," Richard said, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and false hope. "We will all be there. I promise you our family is perfectly unified. We will prove it to your executives tomorrow." "Excellent," Marcus replied, his tone chillingly polite. "The chief executive officer will be eagerly waiting to meet you all. Goodbye, Mr. Reed." The line clicked dead. I leaned back in my leather chair, a cold, triumphant smile spreading across my face. Richard had just willingly agreed to march his entire abusive, arrogant family directly into the center of the slaughterhouse. They were going to walk through the front doors of my corporate empire, completely unaware that the woman they had dismissed as a blue-collar, nobody was sitting at the head of the table, holding the absolute power to erase their entire existence from the map. The trap was perfectly set, the legal documentation was finalized, and tomorrow morning, the Reed family would finally experience the true meaning of a flawless, catastrophic destruction. With the trap perfectly set for tomorrow morning, I shifted my focus entirely back to my sister. The attending physician cleared Clara for discharge late that afternoon, confirming that her fluid levels had stabilized and the baby was no longer in immediate distress. I did not leave anything to chance. I dispatched a fleet of 3 armored black vehicles to the medical center, complete with a specialized extraction team, to ensure no desperate member of the Reed family could ambush us in the parking garage. Clara walked out of the hospital leaning heavily on my arm, wrapped in a comfortable cashmere sweater I had brought for her. She looked exhausted, her eyes shadowed with the profound grief of a shattered marriage, but her posture was straight. She was finally safe. The drive to my primary residence was swift and silent. I live in a heavily fortified tri-level penthouse, occupying the top floors of a luxury residential high-rise in downtown Austin. The building features biometric security scanners, private elevators, and a 24-hour armed concierge team. It is a fortress disguised as architectural perfection. As the private elevator doors parted, stepping directly into my expansive foyer, Clara let out a long, shuddering breath. The panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the city skyline, bathing the sleek, minimalist living space in the warm, golden glow of the setting Texas sun. I guided her to the oversized velvet sectional sofa, wrapping a soft, woven throw blanket around her shoulders. A private chef I kept on retainer had already prepared a nutrient-dense, easily digestible meal tailored specifically for a recovering, expectant mother. Clara ate quietly, processing the monumental shift in her reality. For years, she had deliberately chosen a life of profound simplicity. She had genuinely believed that by hiding her status as a primary beneficiary of the Apex Family Trust, she was protecting herself from the exact type of greedy, superficial people she had ultimately married into. Now, sitting in the heart of my financial empire, she realized that wealth was not just a burden to be hidden. It was a weapon that could be wielded to protect the innocent. She set her bowl down and looked across the polished glass coffee table. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears, "for saving me today, for all of this." I sat beside her, gently taking her hand. "You never have to thank me for protecting you, Clara. I told you years ago that if you ever needed the family, we would be there. You wanted to see the good in Bradley. You wanted to believe his family was capable of genuine love. You have a beautiful, forgiving heart, but they do not deserve your forgiveness. They only deserve consequences." Clara looked down at her pregnant belly, her hand resting protectively over the child she had fought so hard to keep alive on that blistering highway. She nodded slowly, the last remnants of her naive optimism fading away, replaced by the quiet, undeniable strength of our bloodline. "I am done hiding," she stated firmly. "I am filing for full custody tomorrow. Whatever you and Dominic are planning to do to them, do it. I will not shed a single tear for that family ever again." I smiled, incredibly proud of her resilience. With Clara comfortably settled in the guest suite, under the watchful eyes of my elite security personnel, I transitioned to the eastern wing of the penthouse. This area functioned as my secondary command center, a sleek, glass-walled office fully equipped for high-stakes corporate warfare. Jasmine was already waiting for me inside. She had spent the last several hours finalizing the legal architecture of tomorrow's execution. The large mahogany conference table was covered in pristine, heavy cardstock folders. There was a palpable electric energy humming in the room. This was the quiet, dangerous calm before a catastrophic storm. We did not speak immediately. We simply began the methodical process of organizing the instruments of their absolute destruction. Jasmine carefully arranged the federal fraud dossiers into precise chronological order. These thick, intimidating files contained irrefutable evidence of Richard Reed's blatant tax evasion, his elaborate network of phantom logistics vendors, and the offshore shell accounts he used to launder stolen corporate funds to pay for Patricia's country club lifestyle. Beside those devastating documents, she placed the printed documentation of Bradley's systematic theft from Clara's modest teaching salary. This particular paper trail would guarantee him a cold prison cell and permanently strip him of any custody rights to my future niece or nephew. I stood at the opposite end of the long table, assembling the corporate takeover documents. The Apex Holdings acquisition contracts were flawless. I stacked the debt portfolios, the mortgage foreclosure notices for their sprawling suburban mansion, and the immediate asset seizure protocols for Courtney's leased vehicles and frozen credit accounts. We moved with silent, synchronized precision. When the documentation was perfectly aligned, we walked into the adjoining dressing room to prepare our armor for the morning. I selected a pristine, tailored black suit that projected absolute authority and uncompromising power. Jasmine chose a sharp navy blue skirt suit, the exact attire she wore when dismantling corrupt executives in federal courtrooms. We stood side by side in front of the massive illuminated vanity mirror examining our reflections. There was no hesitation, no mercy, and no doubt in our eyes. We were two apex predators preparing for a flawless hunt. The Reed family was going to walk blindly into my boardroom at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, expecting to secure a miraculous corporate bailout to save their pathetic, crumbling empire. Instead, they were going to be financially eviscerated, legally destroyed, and permanently erased from civilized society. I gently closed the heavy leather cover of the master binder, the quiet thud echoing in the stillness of the penthouse. The guillotine was perfectly set. The blade was razor sharp, and the execution was absolutely inevitable. The morning sun rose over the Austin skyline, casting brilliant rays of golden light against the towering glass facade of the Apex Holdings headquarters. I stood quietly in the center of the expansive main lobby, waiting with absolute, unwavering patience. The architecture of my building was deliberately designed to intimidate. Massive pillars of polished black marble stretched upward toward a soaring vaulted ceiling. The floors were a pristine expanse of imported white stone, reflecting the cold, calculated environment of a financial empire that controlled billions of dollars in global assets. I wore the perfectly tailored black suit I had selected the night before, a physical manifestation of the uncompromising power I was about to wield. My posture was perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly at my sides. Every member of my highly trained security staff had been briefed. The receptionist, standing behind a curving desk of frosted glass, knew exactly what was about to happen. They had strict instructions to let the targets enter without any initial interference. I positioned myself near the dedicated security checkpoint that led to the private executive elevators. I wanted to be the very first thing they saw when they walked into my domain. At precisely 8:45 in the morning, the heavy revolving glass doors at the front entrance began to spin. The Reed family stepped into the cavernous lobby, bringing their toxic, desperate energy into my pristine sanctuary. I observed their arrival with the clinical detachment of a predator, watching its prey wander blindly into a carefully constructed snare. Richard Reed walked at the front of the group, attempting to project the formidable aura of a successful corporate titan. He wore a dark, expensive suit, but his posture betrayed the crushing, suffocating weight of the $20 million in debt currently destroying his life. He tugged nervously at his collar, his eyes darting around the massive lobby, clearly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the wealth surrounding him. He was a man who thought he ruled the world, completely unaware that he was merely a microscopic insect stepping into the web of a massive financial spider. Patricia Reed walked closely beside her husband, her face a rigid mask of forced composure. She was desperately clinging to the fragile illusion of her high society status. She wore a pristine white dress and carried a designer handbag that I knew was funded by her husband's extensive corporate tax fraud. She looked around the imposing lobby, her eyes calculating the immense value of the modern art installations and the imported marble columns. She was trying to act as though she belonged in a place of such unimaginable power, but the tight, anxious grip she maintained on her expensive purse revealed her deep, undeniable insecurity. She was terrified of losing her country club lifestyle, completely ignorant of the fact that she had already lost absolutely everything. Trailing slightly behind their parents were Bradley and Courtney. Bradley looked completely miserable, His shoulders were slumped and he dragged his feet across the polished floor with the defeated energy of a coward who knew his comfortable existence was rapidly unraveling. He kept looking down at his shoes, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the building. He lacked the spine to even pretend he was brave. Courtney, however, was a different story entirely. Despite experiencing a catastrophic, humiliating public meltdown at a luxury boutique just yesterday, she was stubbornly attempting to maintain her delusional influencer persona. She held her smartphone up in front of her face, capturing video of the impressive corporate lobby, likely planning to post the footage later to pretend her family was conducting high-level business negotiations. She was a walking, talking monument to superficiality. As they moved deeper into the lobby, Courtney lowered her phone to adjust her designer sunglasses. That was the exact moment her gaze swept across the marble floor and landed directly on me. She stopped walking. A look of genuine confusion washed over her heavily contoured face, quickly followed by a twisted, arrogant sneer. She nudged her mother, pointing a manicured finger in my direction. Patricia looked over and her false composure fractured into an expression of sheer, unadulterated disgust. They altered their path, marching aggressively toward where I stood near the private elevators. They were so blinded by their own bloated sense of superiority that they failed to recognize the obvious danger. They assumed the world still bent to their entitled demands. Courtney stepped forward, stopping just a few feet away from me. She looked me up and down, taking in my tailored black suit, completely misinterpreting my professional attire. She let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed sharply against the marble walls. "Did you actually get a job answering phones here?" she asked, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "I guess you had to find a way to pay those hospital bills since your sister is a broke loser." She turned to her mother, sharing a cruel, victorious smile, before looking back at me with absolute contempt. "Do me a favor and make yourself useful. Get me a latte, peasant, and make sure they use skim milk. I do not have time to deal with incompetent receptionists today." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I looked deep into Courtney's vacant, arrogant eyes and then shifted my cold gaze to Patricia, who was smiling smugly at her daughter's pathetic insult. I let the silence stretch for a moment, allowing their foolish assumptions to solidify. I slowly reached into my pocket and retrieved a sleek, solid black access card. I turned smoothly and pressed the card against the biometric scanner mounted next to the private executive elevator. A soft chime sounded, and the heavy stainless steel doors slid open instantly. I stepped into the luxurious wood-paneled interior of the private carriage, turning back to face the profoundly confused Reed family. I pressed the button for the top floor, maintaining unwavering eye contact with Courtney as the doors began to close. "I prefer my coffee black," I said, my voice smooth, even, and devastatingly calm. "See you upstairs." The heavy steel doors sealed shut, cutting off the sight of their baffled, suddenly anxious faces. As the high-speed elevator shot upward toward the executive penthouse, I felt a deep, resonant calm settle over my entire body. The initial engagement was flawlessly executed. They had taken the bait, completely swallowed their own toxic arrogance, and voluntarily walked into the slaughterhouse. The digital numbers above the elevator doors climbed rapidly, counting down the final seconds of their miserable, fraudulent empire. I stepped out onto the executive floor, the thick carpet silencing my footsteps as I moved toward the ultimate confrontation. The time for subtle maneuvers and quiet surveillance had officially concluded. The boardroom was waiting, and the execution was about to commence. The Reed family was escorted to the top floor by a silent, imposing security guard who offered absolutely no answers to their nervous, whispered questions. They were guided down a long, wide corridor lined with abstract paintings and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying panoramic view of the entire city of Austin. The atmosphere on the executive level was remarkably different from the bustling lobby below. It was a realm of hushed, intimidating silence, a place where multi-billion-dollar decisions were made with a simple nod of a head. The security guard stopped in front of a massive set of double doors made of frosted glass and heavy mahogany wood. He opened them smoothly, gesturing for the family to enter the primary conference room. The boardroom was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. A massive custom-built glass table stretched down the center of the room, surrounded by 20 luxurious leather ergonomic chairs. The far wall was entirely constructed of reinforced glass, providing a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the skyline. The remaining walls were paneled in rich, dark wood, creating a space that felt both expansive and incredibly isolating. At the far end of the long glass table sat Marcus. My senior proxy and lead acquisition specialist looked immaculate in a dark navy suit. He did not stand when the Reeds entered the room. He merely gestured with an elegant wave of his hand, directing them to take the 4 empty chairs positioned on the opposite side of the table. His predatory politeness was perfectly calibrated to maximize their internal discomfort. Richard pulled out a chair for his wife, his movements stiff and jerky. He took the seat next to her, attempting to puff out his chest and project the commanding presence of a successful chief executive officer. He placed a leather portfolio on the glass table, trying to act as though he was a peer engaging in a standard business negotiation. Patricia sat rigidly, her eyes darting nervously around the imposing room, clearly intimidated by the sheer scale of the wealth on display. Bradley slumped into his chair, looking pale and nauseous, completely out of his depth. Courtney sat next to him, her previous arrogance in the lobby now replaced by a sullen, uncomfortable silence. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, suddenly realizing she was trapped in an environment where her social media status meant absolutely nothing. Marcus offered them crystal glasses of sparkling water, speaking in a low, measured tone. He engaged in meaningless, polite small talk, deliberately stretching the tension until it felt like a physical weight, pressing down on their chests. He checked his expensive wristwatch with a slow, deliberate motion, letting the silence expand and fill the massive room. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, a bead of sweat forming near his hairline. The psychological pressure was working flawlessly. They were desperate, terrified, and completely vulnerable. They were waiting for the mysterious savior who held the power to rescue them from bankruptcy, completely oblivious to the fact that their absolute worst nightmare was waiting just on the other side of the frosted glass doors. The heavy double doors suddenly clicked, the latch releasing with a sharp, definitive sound that made everyone in the room jump. The doors swung open slowly, smoothly, and perfectly synchronized. I walked into the massive boardroom, my footsteps steady and deliberate. Jasmine walked exactly half a pace behind me and to my right, carrying her silver briefcase with the devastating federal fraud dossiers inside. We moved with synchronized, uncompromising power, a unified front of absolute destruction. I did not look at the Reeds as I walked the entire length of the room. I moved with the innate, unquestionable authority of someone who owned the building, the company, and the very air they were currently breathing. I reached the head of the long glass table and pulled out the oversized executive chair. I sat down smoothly, resting my hands on the cool glass surface. Jasmine remained standing to my right, a silent, lethal sentinel, placing her silver briefcase on the table with a heavy, final thud. I finally raised my eyes and locked my gaze directly onto Richard Reed. The reaction across the table was a portrait of pure, unadulterated shock. They were completely paralyzed. Patricia let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. Courtney stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, the memory of her insulting me in the lobby suddenly crashing down upon her. Bradley looked as though he was going to vomit right there on the pristine glass table. Richard was the first to break the suffocating silence. He slammed his hands down on the table, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. He looked wildly from me to Marcus, completely unable to process the reality unfolding before him. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and profound confusion. "What is she doing here? Why is Clara's sister sitting in that chair? I demand to speak with the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings right now. This is a highly confidential financial negotiation, and I will not be mocked by some vindictive family member playing a ridiculous game." Marcus remained perfectly calm, He did not raise his voice, nor did he break his professional demeanor. He simply stood up from his chair, buttoned his suit jacket, and looked directly at the crumbling patriarch of the Reed family. Mr. Reed Marcus said, his voice ringing clearly across the quiet, expansive boardroom. "There is no game being played here today. You demanded to speak with the leadership of this firm, and your request has been honored." Marcus extended his hand toward me, his gesture respectful and absolute. "May I formally introduce the Chief Executive Officer, the founding principal, and the majority shareholder of Apex Crisis Management and Private Equity, Stella." The words dropped into the room like heavy stones. The Reeds sat perfectly still, completely paralyzed by the crushing, inescapable weight of their catastrophic mistake. The truth finally shattered their delusional world. The poor blue-collar sister they had abandoned on a burning highway, the woman they had mocked and insulted in the lobby just 10 minutes ago, was the billionaire apex predator holding their entire miserable existence in the palm of her hand. They had willingly walked into the trap, and the doors had just locked securely from the outside. The heavy silence in the boardroom was absolute. No one moved. No one seemed to even breathe. Richard stared at me from the opposite end of the long glass table, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish pulled fresh from the water. The arrogant bluster that had defined his entire existence completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the hollow shell of a terrified man. Patricia looked as though she might physically collapse into her expensive leather chair. Her manicured hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly, her knuckles were stark white. Courtney kept shaking her head back and forth silently, denying the reality unfolding right before her eyes. Bradley simply stared at the floor, his cowardice rendering him entirely mute in the face of my absolute authority. I did not yell, I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. In the world of high-stakes private equity, the most devastating strikes are delivered with perfect chilling calm. I reached out and tapped a single button on the sleek control panel embedded in the surface of my desk. The lights in the massive boardroom dimmed instantly. A hidden projector hummed to life overhead, casting a massive high-definition image onto the frosted glass wall directly behind me. The first slide illuminated the dark room with glaring red spreadsheets. I looked at Richard, letting him absorb the monumental scale of his own failure. "This is the master ledger for your primary logistics company," I stated clearly, my voice carrying effortlessly across the silence. "As you can see, I have highlighted the $20 million in toxic debt currently crushing your business. But that is merely the surface of your profound incompetence, Richard." I tapped the control panel again. The screen shifted, displaying a complex, undeniable web of fraudulent transactions. "These are the phantom vendors you created to launder corporate funds. You systematically build your own failing enterprise for shipping routes that never existed, funneling that capital directly into offshore shell accounts." Richard flinched as if I had struck him across the face. He looked wildly at Marcus, searching for some kind of mistake, but found only the cold, unyielding gaze of my senior proxy. I did not give Richard a moment to recover. I advanced to the next slide. A detailed, itemized list of extravagant personal expenditures flooded the screen. I shifted my attention to Patricia, who shrank back under my scrutiny. "These are the corporate expense accounts," I explained smoothly. "Over the past 7 years, you have personally drained hundreds of thousands of dollars from a dying company to finance your fragile illusion of upper-class society. Every single country club luncheon, every imported bottle of champagne, every luxury vacation you took while mocking my sister for her modest lifestyle was paid for with stolen, laundered money. You did not earn your status, Patricia. You simply embezzled it." The color completely drained from her face. She looked at her husband desperately, waiting for him to deny these accusations to protect her precious reputation, but Richard remained absolutely paralyzed by his own impending doom. I turned my gaze toward Courtney. She was still wearing the same designer sunglasses she had arrogantly flaunted in my lobby just a short while ago. I pressed the button once more. The screen filled with high-resolution photographs captured from her recent live-stream broadcast, alongside the detailed decline codes from her various credit cards. You wondered why your premium black card was declined yesterday afternoon, Courtney. I asked, my tone dripping with icy precision. You stood in that luxury boutique and threw a massive public tantrum because you could not comprehend why your endless supply of free money had suddenly evaporated. The answer is currently displayed right behind me. You have been funding your ridiculous superficial social media lifestyle through a fraudulent corporate expense account listed under office supplies and client entertainment. When we froze those accounts, your entire fabricated identity ceased to exist. Courtney removed her sunglasses with a trembling hand. Tears of pure humiliation welled in her eyes as the magnitude of her public exposure finally registered. I let them all sit in the agonizing truth for a long, heavy moment. The room was so quiet, I could hear the faint rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on the wall. They had walked into this building expecting a generous corporate bailout from a faceless holding company. They expected to manipulate a generic board of executives with their practiced lies and artificial charm. Instead, they found the very woman they had deemed a blue-collar nobody currently holding the absolute power to erase their family name from the financial sector. They were entirely defenseless against the storm they had foolishly provoked. Richard finally found his voice. It was a weak, pathetic rasp that barely reached across the glass table. "You bought our debt," he whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "You are the private equity firm that purchased our obligations from the regional bank." I smiled, a cold, predatory expression that offered absolutely no mercy. "I did not just buy your corporate debt," Richard I replied, leaning forward slightly to ensure every single word penetrated his thick skull. "Apex Holdings acquired your entire financial existence. I bought the primary mortgage on your sprawling suburban mansion. I purchased the secondary lines of credit you used to keep your business artificially inflated. I even acquired the lease agreement on Courtney's imported luxury car. You came here begging for a lifeline, completely unaware that I am the one holding the other end of the rope. I do not just own your company, Richard. I own the mortgage on your mansion. I own the lease on Courtney's car." The crushing reality of their total financial ruin hung heavily in the freezing air of the executive boardroom. Richard Reed slouched downward in his premium leather chair, his breathing ragged and shallow as he stared blankly at the dark mahogany table. Patricia covered her face with her trembling hands, her quiet sobs providing a pathetic soundtrack to their ultimate downfall. They had lost their home, their cars, and their fragile societal status in a matter of mere minutes. But the financial evisceration I had just delivered was only the very first phase of our meticulously planned retaliation. The loss of their stolen wealth was a corporate consequence, but the crimes they had committed required a far more severe, deeply personal level of absolute justice. I leaned back into my seat, folding my hands together, and yielded the floor to the most dangerous woman in the room. Jasmine stepped forward, moving with the quiet, majestic lethality of a true apex predator. She had remained perfectly still and silent throughout my financial presentation, a steadfast shadow standing faithfully by my right side. Now she commanded the center of the room. Her navy blue skirt suit projected an aura of unyielding federal authority that immediately forced Richard to look up in sheer terror. She reached out and firmly grasped the handle of her silver briefcase. With a sharp, distinct mechanical click that echoed loudly against the glass walls, she opened the locks and withdrew a remarkably thick, heavily bound legal dossier. She did not rush her movements. She walked slowly, deliberately around the edge of the massive glass conference table until she was standing directly across from the crumbling patriarch of the Reed family. She raised her arm and smoothly slid the heavy document across the polished surface. It stopped exactly inches away from Richard's trembling hands. Richard looked down at the intimidating stack of papers, completely terrified to even touch the thick cardboard binding. He looked up at Jasmine, his eyes wide and pleading, desperately hoping for a fraction of mercy that he would never receive. Jasmine looked down at him with an expression of profound, unadulterated disgust. She placed her hands flat on the glass table, leaning inward to ensure her melodic, terrifying voice reached every single member of the deceitful family. Her presence demanded total submission from the people who had cruelly tortured my pregnant sister. This is a draft of the indictment I am forwarding to the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Jasmine stated her articulation flawless and cutting. As a federal litigator, I have spent my entire career dismantling corrupt organizations far more sophisticated than your amateur operation. We have meticulously documented every single instance of wire fraud, tax evasion, and corporate embezzlement you have committed over the past decade. The sheer volume of evidence we have compiled is absolutely staggering. You did not just falsify a few minor tax records, Richard. You orchestrated a systemic, deliberate campaign of financial theft across multiple state lines. This indictment guarantees that you will not just face bankruptcy proceedings. You will be facing a minimum of 20 years inside a federal penitentiary. Patricia let out a loud, agonizing wail, dropping her head onto the glass table. Richard turned ashen, his mouth opening in a silent scream of pure terror. The threat of losing his country club membership was nothing compared to the sudden horrifying reality of wearing a prison uniform. He tried to speak, to beg, to offer some kind of pathetic negotiation, but his throat was completely dry. Jasmine did not give him a chance to find his voice. She turned her intense, unforgiving gaze toward the far end of the table, locking eyes with the man who had abandoned my pregnant sister on that sweltering Texas highway. Oh, and Bradley, Jasmine added, her voice dropping to a low, incredibly dangerous register. Do not think for a single second that you have escaped this legal reckoning. Your father may be a prolific corporate criminal, but you possess a special brand of sickening cowardice. Bradley shrank back into his chair, trying desperately to make himself invisible under her intense scrutiny. We looked very closely into your personal finances, Bradley. Jasmine continued, pulling a secondary, thinner file from her briefcase and tossing it onto the table. We found the hidden private account where you stole Clara's salary. We tracked every single unauthorized transfer you made to pay the expensive lease on your precious sports car. You siphoned money from your pregnant wife while she clipped coupons to buy groceries. That is not just a profound moral failure. That is domestic financial abuse and grand larceny. Bradley's face drained of all remaining color. He looked frantically at his parents, seeking some kind of protection, but they were entirely consumed by their own catastrophic problems. I was just holding the money in a safe place, Bradley stammered, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation. I was going to use it for the baby. It was a joint marital asset. You cannot prove I stole anything. Jasmine laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that sliced through his pathetic lie. Do not insult my intelligence, Bradley, she countered smoothly. I have the digital routing numbers, the forged authorization signatures, and the electronic timestamps proving you intentionally hid those assets. When I present this evidence to the judge during your upcoming divorce proceedings, you will be stripped of everything. You will be ordered to pay full restitution, and I will personally ensure that your parental rights are permanently severed due to financial exploitation and reckless endangerment. The entire Reed family sat in a state of absolute paralyzed devastation. They had walked into the Apex Holdings lobby, expecting to conquer a faceless corporation, only to be systematically crushed by the very people they had underestimated and abused. Jasmine stood tall, adjusting the lapels of her pristine navy suit, radiating the majestic power of a woman who had just successfully executed a flawless legal slaughter. The crushing silence inside the executive boardroom was absolute. Jasmine stood tall, adjusting the lapels of her pristine navy suit, radiating the majestic power of a woman who had executed a flawless legal slaughter. The Reed family was entirely broken. Richard clutched his chest as if struggling to draw oxygen into his lungs. Patricia was quietly weeping into her hands, her designer illusions completely destroyed. Courtney stared blankly at the polished glass table, realizing her entire social identity had been funded by criminal activity. But it was Bradley who broke the profound silence. He was sweating profusely. He realized with absolute horrifying clarity that he was facing federal prison time for stealing from his pregnant wife. Panic consumed him entirely. He reached into his pocket with violently trembling hands and pulled out his smartphone. In a final, incredibly pathetic act of sheer desperation, he decided to use the only weapon he thought he still possessed. He still believed he could influence Clara. In his mind, my younger sister remained the gentle kindergarten teacher who would easily give in and overlook his mistakes. He placed his phone in the middle of the large glass conference table and switched on the speakerphone, seemingly relying on his pregnant wife as a way to ease the tense atmosphere we had created. The dialing tone echoed loudly against the mahogany walls of the boardroom. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. The tension in the room was suffocating. Richard and Patricia leaned forward slightly, a pathetic glimmer of desperate hope flashing in their tear-filled eyes. They were praying that the naive girl they had abandoned on a blistering Texas highway would somehow command me to call off this financial execution. They still believed Clara was weak. The phone clicked and the line connected. A soft, steady breath could be heard through the speaker. Clara Bradley blurted out, his voice cracking with a sickening mixture of fake affection and genuine terror. "Honey, thank God you answered. You have to listen to me. There has been a massive misunderstanding. I am sitting here in a boardroom and your family is threatening to destroy us." He leaned closer to the phone, his hands gripping the edge of the glass table so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. "Clara, please. You have to call off your crazy sister. She is threatening to put my father in federal prison. She is threatening to take away my car and my bank accounts. Please, baby, you have to stop this right now. We are a family. We are having a baby together. You know I love you. Please just tell Stella to back down and let us go home." Bradley waited, panting slightly, expecting the familiar, comforting sound of his wife rushing to soothe his anxiety. He expected her to apologize for my aggressive actions. The silence radiating from the speakerphone was heavy and profound. I looked at Jasmine, and we shared a brief, knowing glance. We knew exactly who was on the other end of that line, and she was no longer the fragile victim they had tortured. When Clara finally spoke, her voice was a revelation. It did not shake. It did not waver. It was completely stripped of the desperate need for approval that had defined her relationship with the Reed family for years. Her tone was incredibly calm, beautifully composed, and chillingly detached. It was the voice of a woman who had fully embraced the formidable strength of her bloodline. "I heard everything you just said, Bradley." Clara stated, her words flowing smoothly and deliberately through the speaker. "And I want you to listen to me very carefully. I am sitting in Stella's penthouse, completely safe and looking out over the city. I am not calling off my sister. I am not calling off Jasmine. I am not protecting your family ever again. You left me to die on a dirt road in 104-degree heat. You stole my salary to pay for your sports car. We are not a family. We were never a family." Bradley gasped, his eyes widening in total shock. "Clara, wait, please," he begged, reaching out toward the phone as if he could physically grab hold of her fading loyalty. Clara did not let him finish his pathetic plea. "I filed for divorce this morning, Bradley," she announced with absolute, unyielding clarity. "I am seeking full custody of our child. Have a nice life." A sharp, definitive click echoed through the silent boardroom as Clara instantly disconnected the call. The dial tone hummed monotonously for 3 seconds before the phone screen went completely dark. Bradley collapsed backward into his premium leather chair, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream of absolute despair. The final tether to his comfortable parasitic existence had just been ruthlessly severed by the very woman he thought he could manipulate forever. He looked at the black screen of his phone, completely unable to process the magnitude of his total abandonment. Patricia let out a quiet, defeated moan, letting her head rest against the cool glass table. Richard simply stared blankly ahead, his spirit completely broken by the overwhelming reality of his impending federal incarceration. Courtney wrapped her arms around herself, shivering as if the temperature in the room had suddenly dropped below freezing. I stood up slowly from my executive chair at the head of the table. I smoothly buttoned my tailored black suit jacket, feeling the glorious, undeniable rush of absolute victory flowing through my veins. I looked down at the shattered, pathetic remnants of the arrogant Reed family. They had walked into this building expecting a generous financial rescue. They had expected to maintain their illusions of grandeur. I placed my hands flat on the polished glass surface and leaned forward one last time. Your bailout is denied, I stated with finality. Security will escort you out of my building now. You have absolutely nothing left. 48 hours after that devastating boardroom execution, the administrative machinery of Apex Holdings moved with the terrifying, unstoppable precision of a natural disaster. When a financial portfolio is heavily leveraged with deeply fraudulent corporate capital, the standard grace periods for mortgage foreclosure completely evaporate. Jasmine had expertly invoked a specialized federal acceleration clause buried deep within the fine print of Richard Reed's defaulted loans. They were not given 30 days to vacate. They were not given a week. They were given exactly 0 notice before the consequences of their spectacular arrogance arrived directly at their custom mahogany front door. I sat comfortably in my downtown penthouse sipping a cup of freshly brewed black coffee while I watched the live security feed transmitted from the private asset seizure team I had specifically dispatched to their exclusive country club neighborhood. The morning was predictably bright and beautiful, the kind of pristine Texas day that usually found Patricia Reed pruning her imported roses or hosting expensive catered brunches for her superficial friends. Instead, the tranquil silence of the affluent suburban street was entirely shattered by the sudden heavy arrival of 3 marked county sheriff vehicles, followed closely by a fleet of unmarked black vans belonging to my elite corporate asset recovery division. The uniformed sheriffs marched up the perfectly manicured brick walkway and pounded heavily on the grand double doors. It took nearly 2 minutes for Patricia to answer. When she finally pulled the door open, she was wearing a luxurious silk morning robe, her hair wrapped elegantly in an expensive silk scarf. The expression of mild, entitled annoyance on her face instantly dissolved into a mask of pure, unfiltered horror as she registered the badges, the weapons, and the stern, uncompromising faces of the law enforcement officers standing on her pristine welcome mat. The lead sheriff did not offer a polite greeting. He simply stepped forward and handed her a thick, legally binding eviction notice, informing her that the property had been officially seized by the primary lien holder due to massive systemic financial fraud. He explicitly instructed her that she and her family had exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises before they would be arrested for criminal trespassing. Patricia tried to argue, her voice rising to a shrill, desperate shriek that echoed across the quiet, perfectly landscaped neighborhood. She demanded to call her lawyer, completely forgetting that her legal representation had permanently abandoned her days ago. Richard and Bradley stumbled down the grand, sweeping staircase, looking disheveled and deeply panicked. The asset recovery agents smoothly bypassed the protesting family and immediately entered the residence, spreading out across the massive house to secure the valuable fixtures, the imported furniture, and the expensive electronics that had all been purchased with stolen, laundered money. When Patricia rushed toward her expansive walk-in closet to salvage her collection of designer handbags and diamond jewelry, an agent firmly blocked her path. He coldly informed her that all luxury goods acquired through corporate embezzlement were now classified as seized collateral. They were legally permitted to take only basic essential clothing and personal hygiene items. The agent then handed Patricia a stack of heavy-duty industrial black trash bags, the profound, poetic justice of watching a woman who had treated my sister like garbage being forced to pack her entire miserable life into actual garbage bags was a masterpiece of karmic retribution. The commotion naturally drew the attention of the surrounding neighborhood. The Reeds had spent years desperately trying to impress these exact people, flaunting their fabricated wealth to secure their position at the very top of the local social hierarchy. Now the heavy wooden doors of their mansion were propped wide open, exposing their absolute financial ruin to the entire world. The women from Patricia's exclusive country club luncheon, the very same women who had sat and sipped mimosas while Patricia mocked my sister's heat stroke, were now standing on the opposite sidewalk. They clustered together in their designer athletic wear, whispering behind their hands, pointing and openly taking photographs with their smartphones. They watched with morbid, undeniable fascination as the illusion of the Reed family completely disintegrated. Patricia dragged a lumpy, overflowing black trash bag out the front door, her silk robe dragging pathetically across the concrete driveway. She looked across the manicured lawn and locked eyes with her former friends. She opened her mouth perhaps to offer some desperate, fabricated excuse, but the women simply turned their backs on her and walked away in unison. The ultimate social rejection struck her harder than any physical blow ever could. Her status, the only thing she truly valued in this world, was permanently extinguished. Richard and Bradley followed shortly behind her, their heads bowed in total disgrace, carrying their own pathetic plastic bags filled with wrinkled clothes. Because Apex Holdings had already repossessed their fleet of luxury vehicles, the family was forced to pile their trash bags into the trunk of a cheap dented rental car Bradley had managed to secure with the very last of his remaining cash. They drove away from the magnificent estate in absolute, crushing silence, leaving their entire fraudulent legacy behind them in the dust. The physical loss of their sprawling suburban mansion was only the first dimension of their total ruin. Courtney Reed, stubbornly refusing to accept the permanent destruction of her fabricated reality, decided to launch a desperate, incredibly foolish counterattack. Confined to the cramped, depressing interior of a budget motel room on the outskirts of the city, she set up her portable ring light and positioned her smartphone camera. She was determined to leverage her remaining social media followers, hoping to weaponize her digital audience against my company. She went live on her primary platform, tears of carefully manufactured distress streaming down her heavily contoured face. She stared into the camera lens and began spinning a wild, entirely fictional narrative of victimhood. She tragically claimed that her family was being ruthlessly persecuted by a massive evil corporate bully. She sobbed dramatically, alleging that a jealous, vindictive billionaire had illegally seized their beloved family home and frozen their bank accounts out of pure, unprovoked malice. She begged her followers for sympathy, asking them to organize a massive boycott against Apex Holdings, attempting to paint herself as a helpless martyr crushed by the cruel gears of capitalism. I sat at my desk watching her pathetic performance unfold on my monitor. Jasmine stood beside me, her arms crossed, a dark, victorious smile playing across her lips. We had anticipated this exact maneuver. A narcissist stripped of her resources will always seek validation from the only audience she has left. Fortunately, we had prepared a devastating digital payload specifically designed for this very moment. I did not need to issue a public statement or engage in a petty online argument. I simply gave Jasmine a subtle nod. Using a network of untraceable anonymous proxy servers, Jasmine released our curated evidence package directly to the most prominent drama channels, major digital influencers, and directly into the rapidly scrolling live chat of Courtney's own broadcast. The release was perfectly synchronized. First, the high-definition security footage from the rural gas station flooded the internet. The silent video clearly showed Patricia's silver Mercedes pulling up to the dusty pumps. It showed Clara heavily pregnant and visibly exhausted, stepping out of the vehicle to use the restroom. And then it clearly captured the undeniable malicious moment when Courtney and Patricia looked at each other, laughed, and deliberately drove away, leaving a vulnerable woman stranded in the blistering, dangerous heat. Seconds after the video circulated, the second piece of evidence dropped. It was a crystal-clear, verified screenshot of the exact text message Courtney had sent to Clara's phone. "Oops, guess we forgot the extra baggage at the rest stop. Hope you wore walking shoes, broke girl. Consider it a prank." The digital backlash was instantaneous, massive, and absolutely catastrophic. I watched the live feed of Courtney's broadcast as the tone of the chat flipped from sympathetic support to pure, unadulterated disgust in a matter of seconds. Thousands of viewers began demanding explanations for the gas station footage. They flooded her comments with the text message, quote, calling her a monster, a sociopath, and an attempted murderer. Courtney stared at her screen, her fake tears suddenly drying up as genuine blinding panic set in. She tried to stammer out a defense, claiming the video was somehow edited or taken out of context, but the evidence was far too raw and undeniable. The internet, a ruthless and unforgiving judge, instantly delivered its verdict. The live viewer count plummeted as disgusted fans abandoned her platform in droves. But the true destruction happened in the background. My intelligence team monitored the automated alerts as Courtney's primary corporate sponsors, the cosmetic brands, the fashion boutiques, and the lifestyle companies that funded her superficial existence, began rapidly terminating their contracts. They released immediate public statements severing all ties with her, citing violations of their morality clauses and condemning her abhorrent behavior. Within a span of less than 3 hours, Courtney Reed lost hundreds of thousands of followers, every single one of her lucrative brand deals, and her entire digital identity. She frantically ended the live broadcast, but the damage was irreversible. She was universally canceled, permanently branded as a cruel, shallow abuser. She had tried to rally the world against me, and in doing so, she had willingly handed me the exact tool I needed to burn her fragile digital empire completely to the ground. The digital obliteration of Courtney Reed was a spectacular prelude, burning away the social media facade of the Reed family legacy. But the digital realm was merely a distraction from the physical consequences currently accelerating toward the family patriarch. While Courtney wept in a cheap motel room, Richard Reed was frantically attempting a final maneuver. The sun had barely risen over Austin when Richard and Patricia unlocked the rear entrance to his primary logistics headquarters. Jasmine had predicted this perfectly. Richard believed he could access a secure server in his private office, a hidden vault containing the last remaining offshore accounts. Patricia accompanied him, clutching a generic canvas tote bag instead of her usual designer leather. She wept quietly, mourning the loss of her country club estate. They moved through the darkened hallways like common thieves. Richard booted up the standalone server, his hands trembling as he typed complex authorization codes. He was desperately trying to initiate a wire transfer to a non-extradition territory, a pathetic exit strategy for a man who once pretended to control millions. Patricia stood by the drawn window blinds, peering anxiously into the empty industrial parking lot. She begged him to hurry in a fragile whisper. She complained that the air conditioning was turned off, completely oblivious that Apex Holdings had terminated the utility contracts at midnight. Richard snapped at her to remain silent, sweat dripping down his forehead as the progress bar on his monitor inched forward. He never saw the flashing lights approaching. At precisely 6:30 in the morning, a fleet of 6 matte black Federal Sport utility vehicles silently turned onto the industrial complex access road. They moved with military precision, forming a tactical perimeter around the logistics headquarters. Jasmine was standing safely across the street, watching her crafted legal dossier manifest into physical justice. She had personally briefed the lead investigators of the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission, handing them a roadmap of pure corporate treason. The federal agents did not bother knocking on the front doors. They used a heavy tactical battering ram to instantly shatter the reinforced glass, the crash echoing violently through the empty building. Richard froze. The progress bar sat at 80%. The sound of heavy combat boots pounding against the tile floors echoed down the hallway, accompanied by sharp voices commanding anyone in the building to show their hands. Patricia let out a blood-curdling shriek, dropping her canvas tote bag and sending cheap cosmetics rolling across the carpet. Richard scrambled backward, tripping over his expensive leather executive chair and crashing hard onto the floor. The heavy wooden door to his private office was kicked open with such explosive force that the brass handle dented the interior drywall. A dozen federal agents swarmed the room instantly. They were clad in dark tactical gear, their presence a suffocating, immovable wall of government authority. The lead agent, a tall, uncompromising man with a stern expression, stepped forward and looked down at the pathetic, trembling figure of the former logistics titan. Richard Reed. The agent barked his voice, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. You are under arrest for multiple counts of felony wire fraud, systemic tax evasion, and aggravated corporate embezzlement. Do not make a sudden movement. Richard tried to speak, but his throat was paralyzed by fear. He attempted to leverage his usual bluster, raising a shaking hand and stammering out a demand to contact his legal team. He claimed there was a massive misunderstanding, that he was the victim of a hostile corporate takeover. The federal agent did not blink at the rehearsed excuses. He simply grabbed Richard by the shoulder, hauled him to his feet, and slammed him against the mahogany wall. The cold click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Richard's wrists was the definitive sound of his permanent destruction. The physical manifestation of his total loss of freedom echoed sharply. He was no longer a wealthy executive. He was a federal inmate. Watching her husband being physically restrained like a common street criminal finally broke the last remaining shard of Patricia's fabricated reality. She completely lost her mind. She threw herself toward the federal agents, shrieking with wild, uncontrolled hysteria. She screamed that it was all a terrible mistake, that they were respected members of the Oakmont Country Club, and that they were wealthy, important people who did not belong in handcuffs. She desperately dropped the names of prominent local politicians, completely oblivious to the fact that those same people had permanently blocked her phone number the moment the eviction vans appeared. The federal agents ignored her frantic, entitled screaming entirely. Two female officers firmly grabbed Patricia by the arms, pulling her back and ordering her to remain silent and compliant, or face immediate charges for obstruction of justice. Patricia collapsed onto her knees, weeping hysterically into her hands, her wails echoing down the hallway as the agents secured the computer server, the hard drives, and the physical ledgers hidden in the desk drawers. Jasmine's dossier had been perfectly accurate, and the agents were collecting the final nails for Richard's coffin. The federal agents marched Richard out of the corporate office, pushing him forcefully down the long corridor and out through the shattered front glass doors of the main entrance. The early morning sun was just cresting the horizon, casting harsh shadows across the pavement. A small, silent crowd of commuters and curious onlookers had gathered near the police barricades. Richard was paraded across the parking lot in his wrinkled suit, his head completely bowed in ultimate, irredeemable disgrace. He was shoved unceremoniously into the cramped back seat of a waiting black federal vehicle. Patricia was escorted out moments later, left to stand alone on the cracked asphalt as the heavy doors slammed shut. They were utterly ruined, permanently stripped of their fake wealth, their stolen status, and their entire future, leaving them with absolutely nothing left but the crushing weight of their own catastrophic choices. The dust from the collapse of the Reed Empire had barely settled when Bradley made his final, most spectacularly foolish mistake. 3 weeks had passed since the federal raid on his father logistics headquarters. Richard sat in a federal holding facility awaiting trial. Patricia had moved into a cramped, depressing budget apartment on the wrong side of the city. Clara, meanwhile, was glowing. She was safely residing in my penthouse, surrounded by unconditional love and the finest prenatal care money could buy. I thought Bradley would simply crawl under a rock and accept his total defeat. But desperation breeds extreme delusion. Driven by his sudden, terrifying poverty, Bradley decided to weaponize his unborn child. He formally filed for full custody in family court, accompanied by a staggering petition for emergency spousal support and child maintenance. In his pathetic mind, he believed that since Clara was legally a billionaire, he could siphon a massive monthly payout to maintain the luxurious lifestyle he had completely lost. He viewed his own child not as a human being, but as a highly lucrative meal ticket. The family court hearing took place on a rainy Tuesday morning. I sat in the polished wooden gallery right behind the petitioner table. Bradley walked into the courtroom wearing a wrinkled, outdated suit that clearly proved his absolute loss of access to premium dry cleaning. He had hired a desperate bottom-tier attorney who looked completely out of his depth. Bradley attempted to project an aura of arrogant confidence, puffing out his chest and refusing to look in my direction. Then, the heavy oak doors swung open and Clara walked in. She was absolutely radiant. She wore a tailored maternity dress in a soft emerald green, her posture perfectly straight and completely unafraid. Jasmine walked right beside her wearing her signature navy blue litigator suit carrying her formidable silver briefcase. When Bradley saw Jasmine, his fake confidence instantly evaporated. He swallowed hard, nervously tugging at his cheap necktie. He suddenly remembered the woman who had effortlessly destroyed his expensive lawyer in a hospital room just a few weeks prior. The presiding judge, a stern older man with absolutely no patience for nonsense, called the hearing to order. Bradley attorney stood up, shuffling a stack of disorganized papers. He launched into a completely fabricated, highly melodramatic narrative. He outrageously claimed that Clara was a deceptive, manipulative billionaire who had intentionally hidden her vast wealth from her loving husband. He painted Bradley as a devoted family man who had been cruelly discarded and maliciously alienated from his unborn child. The attorney aggressively demanded primary physical custody, arguing that Bradley could provide a more stable, grounded environment. He requested an immediate temporary support order of $50,000 a month to ensure the child would enjoy the standard of living commensurate with the Apex Family Trust. Bradley sat back in his chair, nodding solemnly, trying to look like a heartbroken victim. It was a repulsive performance of pure greed. The judge turned his skeptical gaze to the respondent table. Jasmine stood up slowly. She did not bring a disorganized stack of papers. She brought a single sleek digital tablet. Your Honor. Jasmine began, her voice resonating through the courtroom with melodic, terrifying authority. The petitioner is not a devoted father seeking a relationship with his child. He is a financial predator and an active danger to maternal safety. Jasmine connected her tablet to the courtroom display monitors. First, she presented the irrefutable financial records. She detailed exactly how Bradley had systematically stolen 70% of Clara Motta's teaching salary for over 14 months to fund the lease on his imported sports car. The judge frowned deeply, reviewing the highlighted bank transfers. But Jasmine was just warming up. She smoothly transitioned to the day of the hospital admission. Your Honor. Financial abuse is merely the beginning of his profound negligence, Jasmine stated clearly. 3 weeks ago, the petitioner family deliberately abandoned my pregnant client at a closed rural gas station during a severe heat advisory. The temperature was exactly 104 degrees. Jasmine displayed the verified security footage from the gas station on the large screens, followed immediately by the verified screenshot of Courtney Cruel text message. The message labeling Clara as broke extra baggage and calling the abandonment a prank glowed brightly for the entire courtroom to read. Jasmine then submitted the sworn medical affidavits from the emergency room doctors, detailing Clara's severe heat stroke, the extreme dehydration, and the critical fetal distress. And where was the petitioner, while his wife was fighting for her life? Jasmine asked, her tone dropping to a deadly whisper. He strolled into her emergency room, holding an iced coffee, defended his family actions as a harmless joke, and told my client she was being overly dramatic before abandoning her again. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from formal procedure to absolute heavy disgust. The judge stared at the text message on the screen, his face hardening into a mask of pure judicial fury. He looked down at Bradley, who was currently shrinking into his chair, sweating profusely, realizing his greedy gamble had just backfired. His cheap attorney silently packed his briefcase, mentally abandoning the sinking ship. The judge did not even need to call for a recess to deliberate. He struck his wooden gavel with a loud, definitive crack that echoed sharply off the walls. He immediately denied every single one of Bradley's pathetic financial petitions. He stripped Bradley of all current and future physical and legal custody rights, explicitly citing severe reckless endangerment and profound moral depravity. The judge looked directly at Clara with a respectful nod and officially granted her a permanent, heavily enforced restraining order against Bradley and his extended family. Bradley walked out of the courtroom with absolutely nothing, facing an impending criminal investigation for grand larceny, while Clara walked out completely free, vindicated, and ready to welcome her child into a world wiped clean of the toxic Reed legacy. Fast forward 2 months. The oppressive Texas summer surrendered to cooler breezes of early autumn. The high-stakes warfare that consumed our lives during the destruction of the Reed family was now a fading memory. We systematically dismantled their empire, secured Clara's absolute freedom, and erected an impenetrable fortress of legal protection around her. With the toxic debris completely swept away, our focus shifted to the arrival of the newest member of our bloodline. Clara had blossomed during those 8 weeks living in my secure penthouse. Free from the anxiety of Bradley's financial abuse and Patricia's relentless judgment, she returned to the vibrant, joyful woman I had always known. She spent days designing a breathtaking nursery overlooking the Austin skyline, filling the room with classic literature and soft textiles. There were no arguments over country club aesthetics. There was only pure anticipation for the new life she was bringing into the world. When the moment finally arrived on a cool, crisp Tuesday evening, the transition from waiting to action was flawlessly executed. At the very first clear sign of labor, my private security detail mobilized with the quiet efficiency of a highly trained military unit. We did not rush to a crowded, chaotic public emergency room. Instead, we transported Clara to an exclusive state-of-the-art maternity wing at the premier private hospital in the city, an entire floor I had anonymously endowed years ago. The medical staff had been thoroughly vetted and briefed. The environment was meticulously controlled, ensuring that Clara experienced absolutely zero stress beyond the natural rigors of childbirth. There were no unwanted visitors, no toxic manipulative in-laws lurking in the waiting room, and no pathetic spineless husband trying to fake concern for a photograph. I stood by her left side, holding her hand through every intense contraction. Jasmine stood on her right, offering a soothing, steady presence that contrasted beautifully with her usual courtroom lethality. Dominic paced the private, luxurious waiting area outside a formidable guardian, ensuring that the perimeter remained absolutely secure. We were a deeply unified front, a chosen family forged in the fires of corporate warfare and bound by an unbreakable loyalty to one another. We had fought ruthlessly to guarantee this child would be born into a world of profound safety and unconditional love. After several grueling hours, the quiet, focused atmosphere of the delivery room was suddenly pierced by the most beautiful, miraculous sound I had ever heard. A strong, healthy cry echoed against the pristine walls. The attending physician smiled warmly, gently, placing a perfect, squirming baby girl onto Clara's chest. Clara let out a breathless, joyful sob, tears of pure relief and overwhelming love streaming down her flushed cheeks. She wrapped her arms protectively around the tiny, fragile life she had fought so fiercely to save on that scorching highway. The baby had a tuft of dark hair and bright, curious eyes that blinked open to take in her new surroundings. She was completely perfect. The hospital room transformed instantly from a clinical space into a sanctuary of profound, overwhelming joy. The heavy, dark shadows of the past were permanently banished by the radiant light of this new beginning. I looked down at my sister, watching her kiss the top of her daughter's head, and I felt a depth of emotion that no corporate victory could ever match. This was the ultimate return on our investment. This was the true meaning of power. We had utilized our immense resources not just to destroy those who sought to harm us, but to cultivate a deeply nurturing environment where our family could safely thrive. Dominic was finally allowed into the room. The ruthless venture capitalist, a man who casually bankrupted international corporations before breakfast, immediately melted at the sight of his new niece. He walked over to the bed with a reverence that was entirely uncharacteristic of his usual dominating persona. He reached out a massive finger, and the tiny baby instinctively wrapped her microscopic hand around it, holding on with surprising strength. Dominic smiled a genuine, unguarded expression of pure devotion. He looked at Clara, and then at me silently, confirming the silent vow we had all taken. This child would never know the pain of abandonment, the sting of superficial judgment, or the terror of financial abuse. She was an apex, and she would be protected by the most formidable family on the planet. Jasmine leaned down gently, brushing a stray lock of hair from Clara's forehead. "You did remarkably well, Clara," she whispered, her melodic voice filled with profound admiration. "She is absolutely beautiful, and she is entirely yours. No one will ever take her from you, and no one will ever make either of you feel small again. You have the entire weight of our family standing right behind you today and forever." Clara looked up at the three of us, her eyes shining with absolute unwavering trust. She had previously hidden our wealth because she believed it would isolate her from genuine human connection. But the grueling ordeal with the Reed family had taught her a different vital lesson. Our wealth was simply a tool, but our loyalty was the actual treasure. We were not just her siblings and her legal counsel, we were her fortress. She adjusted the soft pink blanket wrapped around the baby, holding her out slightly, so I could finally take my niece into my arms. I carefully cradled the tiny, perfect infant against my chest, feeling the steady, reassuring rhythm of her tiny heartbeat. I looked down at her delicate features, completely overwhelmed by a fierce, uncompromising instinct to protect her from any force that might ever dare to cause her harm. There was no toxic drama in this room. There were no manipulative lies, no gaslighting, and no pathetic attempts to leverage a child for financial gain. There was only a fiercely loyal, unbreakable family unit standing united in the quiet, peaceful dawn of a brand new chapter. The profound peace of that hospital room became the foundation of our new reality. Over the next 12 months, we watched my beautiful niece grow. Clara flourished as a mother, her spirit restored by the support of a family that valued her. The dark shadow of the Reed family had been eradicated from our lives. Richard was serving federal time. Patricia was languishing in obscurity. Courtney had vanished into digital exile. We won the war and moved forward into a chapter of unconditional love and success. Exactly 1 year after that fateful afternoon on the rural highway, the relentless Texas summer returned to Austin with a vengeance. The city baked under a massive dome of high pressure, pushing the temperature to a dangerously familiar 104 degrees. I was spending the afternoon with Clara, celebrating the first birthday of my niece with a dedicated shopping excursion. We strolled leisurely out of an exclusive baby boutique located in the most affluent commercial district of the city. Clara was absolutely radiant, wearing a flowing linen dress that caught the slight and hot breeze. She was no longer the completely exhausted woman desperately trying to appease a family of parasites. She was a confident, empowered mother who fully embraced her worth. My personal security detail shadowed us discreetly, carrying premium shopping bags filled with educational toys and tiny designer clothing. We enjoyed the beautiful luxury of providing the absolute best for the newest member of our bloodline. We stepped off the blazing concrete sidewalk and climbed into the immaculate rear cabin of my customized Maybach. The armored doors sealed shut with a satisfying thud, blocking out the oppressive heat of the afternoon sun. The interior was an oasis of climate-controlled perfection. The dual-zone air conditioning washed over us, dropping the ambient temperature to a crisp 68 degrees. Clara let out a contented sigh, sinking comfortably into the plush leather reclining seats. She reached over to the chilled center console, retrieved a tall glass of freshly squeezed iced lemonade, and took a slow, appreciative sip. The ice cubes clinked cheerfully against the crystal glass, a crisp sound contrasting with the brutal reality existing just outside our heavily tinted bulletproof windows. My driver merged smoothly into the heavy afternoon traffic. I sat beside my sister, enjoying the quiet companionship that only true siblings can share. Our vehicle glided to a smooth halt at a long red light near a major commercial construction zone. The relentless noise of heavy machinery vibrated faintly through the insulated floorboards of the Maybach. I glanced casually out of the passenger window, observing the grueling labor required to build the foundation of a new high-rise. A crew of exhausted municipal utility workers was digging a trench along the side of the scorched asphalt road. The men were covered in a thick layer of pale, chalky dust, their heavy work boots sinking deep into the dry, cracked earth. It was brutal, backbreaking manual labor, performed during the peak of the midday heat advisory. My eyes drifted across the line of exhausted workers and suddenly stopped dead on a painfully familiar profile. Standing in the deepest part of the dusty ditch, wearing a stained neon green safety vest over a sweat-drenched gray shirt, was Bradley. The man who had once arrogantly paraded around expensive country clubs and leased imported sports cars with stolen money was now violently swinging a heavy rusted pickaxe into the unyielding Texas dirt. He looked absolutely atrocious. His skin was burned a blotchy red from exposure to the merciless sun. His perfectly styled hair was matted with grease beneath a cheap cracked plastic hard hat. He paused his grueling labor for a brief second, dropping his tool to wipe a stream of dirty sweat from his brow using the back of his filthy hand. He looked completely defeated. The federal judgments crushing restitution orders and the absolute destruction of his professional reputation had left him with no other options but the most punishing physical labor imaginable. I turned my head slightly to look at Clara. She had followed my gaze through the tinted window and was staring directly at her former husband. She watched him struggle to lift the heavy steel pickaxe, his muscles trembling violently under the extreme agonizing strain of the blistering 104-degree heat. This was the exact same deadly temperature he and his cruel family had callously abandoned her in 1 year ago. The universe had a remarkably beautiful way of delivering absolute symmetrical justice. I waited for Clara to react. I waited to see if a flicker of lingering pity, residual anger, or deeply buried sorrow would cross her radiant features. Clara did not frown. She did not express a single ounce of malicious satisfaction. She did not even bother to roll down the tinted window to gloat over his magnificent poetic downfall. Instead, she looked at the broken, sweating man in the dirty ditch with an expression of pure, unadulterated indifference. He was a complete stranger to her now, a pathetic ghost from a past life that no longer held any power over her emotions. She simply blinked, turned her attention away from the window, and took another refreshing sip of her perfectly chilled iced lemonade. The traffic light turned green. Our driver pressed the accelerator, and the powerful engine of the Maybach purred smoothly as we drove away from the construction site, leaving Bradley behind to choke on our dust in the suffocating heat. We merged onto the open highway, accelerating steadily toward our brilliant, beautifully secure future. Has a toxic in-law ever tried to sabotage you, only to realize they picked a fight with the wrong person? Share your story in the comments below, and do not forget to hit subscribe for more stories of ultimate justice.